After losing his wife, a billionaire father collapses upon learning that his 3 daughters have only 2 weeks to live. When everything seems lost, a woman with no medical training appears, bringing not medicine, but an unbreakable faith in life. What no one knows is that behind her strength lies a silent promise made to the daughter she herself could not save. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The silence weighed like a suffocating blanket over the mansion in Beverly Hills. It was the kind of silence born not of peace, but of a pain so deep it had sucked all the sounds of life from the house. Edward Mason walked through the marble hallways with steps that echoed emptily, as if he were a stranger in his own home. It had been 2 years since Marianne had gone. 2 years since cancer had taken away not only his wife, but also all the joy that had once filled every corner of that place. And his 3 daughters, his precious girls, had become shadows of their former selves. Eleanor, Clara, and Sophia, 7, 5, and 4 years old, respectively. Girls who once ran through the gardens like colorful butterflies, who filled the house with crystalline laughter and endless mischief. Now, they barely left their rooms, barely spoke, barely ate. Edward stopped before the door to Eleanor's room, the eldest. Through the crack, he could see her lying on her princess bed, her brown hair spread across the pink pillow that Marianne had chosen with such care. The girl stared at the ceiling, as still as an abandoned doll. Dr. Oakley had been clear at the last appointment. The girls were developing a severe case of childhood depression. The loss of their mother, combined with their father's emotional isolation, had created a toxic environment. The immune systems of all 3 were compromised. Eleanor had lost 10 pounds in 2 months. Clara hadn't spoken in weeks. Sophia had developed panic attacks that left her breathless. Edward closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold door. How had he gotten here? He who had once been a present, playful father, who invented crazy bedtime stories and taught his daughters to ride bikes in the garden. After Marianne was gone, something inside him had shattered so completely that he could no longer connect with his own children. He had tried everything. Child psychologists, family therapists, private doctors. He had taken the girls on trips, bought them toys, hired entertainers. Nothing worked. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected between them, and the more he tried to tear it down, the taller it grew. Across the hall, the nurse, Joanne, was leaving Clara's room with an untouched tray. Again, the girl had refused to eat. The professional's eyes met Edward's, and she shook her head sadly. "Mr. Mason, we need to talk," she whispered, approaching him. "The girls can't go on like this. Clara is getting thinner every day, and Sophia woke up 3 times last night with nightmares. Eleanor," her voice faltered. "Eleanor asked if she's going to go away like Mommy." The words struck Edward like daggers. He pushed himself away from the wall and went downstairs to the living room, trying to control his now erratic breathing. The house, with its expensive furniture and impeccable decor, felt like a mausoleum. Even the plants Marianne had loved so much were wilting, despite being watered daily. Edward poured himself a whiskey he had no desire to drink, and sat in the leather armchair where he used to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings while the girls played on the rug at his feet. Now, the rug was empty, and the newspaper remained folded and untouched on the coffee table. His phone vibrated. A message from his brother, Robert, asking if he could stop by over the weekend to see his nieces. Edward typed an automatic reply. "They're not well enough for visitors." It was always the same excuse. The truth was, he couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing his daughters in that state of decline. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his dark thoughts. Who could it be? He wasn't expecting anyone, and he had instructed the gatehouse not to allow entry to salespeople or unwanted visitors. Reluctantly, he answered, "Mr. Mason, there's a woman here who says she's here for the job." "Interview." Edward frowned. What interview? He hadn't posted any ad. He hadn't... Then he remembered. Weeks ago, in a moment of desperation after a particularly severe crisis with Sophia, he had asked Robert to post an ad looking for a specialized caregiver. He had later regretted it and completely forgotten about it. "Sir, what should I do?" Edward sighed. Since the woman had gone to the trouble of coming all this way, the least he could do was dismiss her in person. "Send her up." 5 minutes later, he heard light footsteps on the stairs, not the hurried click of high heels or the heavy thud of dress shoes, but something almost musical, as if the person were dancing as she walked. The woman who entered the living room was the opposite of everything Edward expected. She didn't wear a white uniform, didn't carry a briefcase full of certificates, didn't have that serious professional air of the other caregivers he had interviewed months before. She was a simple woman, about 35, with brown hair tied in a messy bun and green eyes that shone with a light he hadn't seen in a long time. She wore a light blue cotton blouse and a long floral skirt. She carried a cloth bag that looked like it had seen better days, but it was clean and well cared for. There was something about her that radiated tranquility, as if she carried with her the serenity of a Sunday afternoon on her childhood farm. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mason. My name is Helen Sanders." Her voice was soft yet firm. It showed no nervousness or anxiety. Edward gestured for her to sit on the sofa opposite his armchair. "Look, Helen, I need to be honest with you. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm no longer looking for a caregiver. My daughter's situation is complicated, very complicated." Helen sat down and folded her hands in her lap, keeping her gaze fixed on him. "I know they're going through a difficult time. Losing a mother is one of the deepest pains a child can face." Her words were simple, but there was something in the way she said them that made Edward sit up straighter. There was no pity in her voice, none of that condescending tone he was used to hearing from professionals. It was just genuine understanding. "Do you have experience with children who are going through depression?" "I have experience with children who have forgotten how to smile," Helen replied. "And I know they don't need more doctors or medicine. They need someone who still believes there is life inside them." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. "You don't understand. My daughters haven't been eating properly for months. The youngest has panic attacks. The middle one doesn't speak. The eldest—" His voice broke. "The eldest asks me if she's going to go away too." Helen leaned forward slightly, and Edward could see that she was truly paying attention to every word. "May I meet them?" The question was so simple and direct that Edward was taken aback. "I don't think that's a good idea. They don't like strangers." "I understand, but maybe I won't be a stranger for long." There was something in her confidence that intrigued him. Edward had grown accustomed to professionals who arrived with diagnoses, protocols, scientific methods. Helen hadn't mentioned any of that. She seemed to just want to meet his daughters as people, not as patients. Against his better judgment, Edward stood up. "All right, but I'm warning you, they probably won't even look at you. And please don't make promises about improvements or miracle cures. I've heard that too many times." Helen stood up as well, and Edward noticed she was shorter than he had imagined, but there was something in her posture that conveyed a quiet strength. They went up the stairs together, and Edward stopped before the first room. "This is Eleanor, the eldest. She's—" But when he opened the door, the words died in his throat. Eleanor was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking directly at them. Her brown eyes, which hadn't shone in months, seemed slightly more alive, as if she had sensed something different in the air. Helen entered the room with gentle movements and crouched down to the girl's level, maintaining a respectful distance. "Hi, Eleanor. I'm Helen. What a beautiful room you have." The girl didn't answer, but she didn't look away as she usually did with other visitors. She watched Helen with cautious curiosity. Helen looked around and noticed the children's drawings hanging on the wall, the dolls arranged on the shelf, the storybooks stacked on the bedside table. "Do you like to draw? I saw some very beautiful drawings on the wall." Eleanor nodded almost imperceptibly. Edward held his breath. His daughter hadn't reacted to anyone in weeks. "Maybe one day you can teach me to draw as well as you do," Helen said, standing up. "For now, I just came to meet you. Goodbye, Eleanor." She left the room without insisting, without trying to force a greater interaction. Edward was surprised by her approach. Most professionals tried to make the girls talk, play, react immediately. In the hallway, he whispered, "She usually doesn't even look at people." "She's just protecting her heart," Helen replied. "She's a very smart girl." They moved on to Clara's room. The 5-year-old was lying on her side, hugging a worn teddy bear that had been a gift from her mother. Her blonde hair was disheveled, and she seemed smaller than she really was. Helen entered and sat on the floor near the bed, but again, without invading the child's space. "Hi, Clara, what a cute teddy bear. What's his name?" Silence. Edward was about to explain that Clara didn't speak, but Helen subtly raised a hand, asking for patience. "He looks like a very special bear. I bet he's had many adventures with you." Clara clutched the bear tighter, but her eyes moved in Helen's direction. "I have a special teddy bear at home too. His name is Theodore. He's very old and has some patched-up parts, but he's still my favorite." For the first time in weeks, Edward saw a flicker of interest in Clara's eyes. Helen stayed for a few more minutes in silence, just sharing the space with the girl, before saying goodbye and leaving. The last room was Sophia's, the youngest. The girl was awake, but huddled under the blanket, only her blue eyes visible above the fabric. When she saw Helen, she hid completely. Helen approached slowly and sat in the small plastic chair next to the bed. "Hi, Sophia. I know you're under the blanket. You don't have to come out if you don't want to. Sometimes I like to hide under the blanket too when I'm feeling a little sad." A nearly imperceptible movement under the blanket. "Do you know what I do when I feel like that? I count the beautiful things I can remember, like yellow flowers, the smell of warm bread, birds singing in the morning." Helen paused. "Can you think of anything beautiful, Sophia?" The blanket moved again, and Edward could see a little eye peeking out. Helen smiled. "I'll let you rest now, but if you want to count beautiful things with me another day, I'd love that." When they left the last room, Edward was visibly shaken. In 15 minutes, Helen had elicited more reactions from his daughters than any professional had in months. Back in the living room, he sat heavily in his armchair. "How did you do that?" "I did nothing but see them," Helen answered. "Not as patients or problems to be solved, as 3 brave little girls who are facing a very great pain." Edward ran his hands over his face. "Do you have children?" Helen hesitated for a moment, and Edward saw a shadow cross her green eyes. "I did," she replied simply. The 2 words carried a weight that Edward recognized immediately. It was the same pain he saw in the mirror every day, but there was something more in Helen's eyes. An acceptance, a peace he couldn't comprehend. "I'm so sorry," he murmured. "Thank you." Helen shifted in her seat. "That's why I know your daughters just need someone who still believes in them, someone who hasn't given up." Edward felt the words like a punch to the gut. Had he given up? Not consciously, but maybe he had. "Are you saying I've given up on my daughters?" "I'm saying that pain sometimes makes us forget how to love," Helen answered gently. "And there's no judgment in that. It's human. But the girls need to see that there is still hope." Edward was silent for a long moment, processing her words. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the Los Angeles sky with shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of sunset Marianne had adored, the kind she used to call him to watch with her from the balcony. "What would you do if I let you try?" Helen leaned forward. "I would start slowly, earn their trust, show them that there are still reasons to smile, that life can be good again." "And what if it doesn't work? What if they continue? Then at least they'll know that someone tried, that someone didn't give up." Helen paused. "But I believe it will work. They're just waiting for someone who can still see the light inside them." Edward looked out the window at the garden Marianne had planted with so much love. It was abandoned, the flowers withered, the grass growing untamed, like everything else in that house. When he turned back to Helen, his decision was made. "When can you start?" Helen arrived the next morning carrying a patterned cloth bag and a discreet smile that seemed to light up the mansion's entrance. Edward was waiting for her in the hall, as nervous as a teenager on a first date. He had spent the entire night wondering if he had made the right decision. "Good morning, Mr. Mason," Helen greeted, and her voice brought an immediate calm to the tense atmosphere. "Good morning. The girls are still asleep. They usually wake up late because they spend the night awake, with nightmares, and—" He cut himself off, realizing he was making excuses. Helen nodded with understanding. That's all right. In the meantime, may I get to know the house better? Understand how they live? Edward guided her through the main rooms, the formal living room that no one used anymore, the TV room where the girls sometimes sat in silence, the spacious kitchen where the housekeeper, Carmen, prepared meals that were barely touched. Helen observed everything attentively, but her gaze lingered especially on the photographs. There were portraits everywhere. Marianne smiling on Santa Monica Beach, the little girls running in the garden, moments of family happiness that now seemed to belong to a different life. Helen stopped before a photo where Marianne was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, planting flowers, while a 5-year-old Eleanor helped her. Your wife enjoyed gardening, Helen observed. She loved it. She used to say plants were like children. They needed care, patience, and love. Edward looked out the window at the abandoned garden. I don't have a knack for these things. Helen followed his gaze. The garden was clearly neglected, but it was still possible to see the traces of the love that had been invested there. Rose bushes struggling to bloom, a small herb garden growing wild, flower beds that just needed a little attention. Perhaps the girls inherited their mother's talent, Helen said softly. Just then, they heard slow steps on the stairs. Eleanor was coming down, still in her pajamas, with disheveled hair and sleepy eyes. When she saw Helen, she stopped halfway down the stairs, uncertain. Good morning, Eleanor, Helen said naturally, as if it were normal for her to be there. Did you sleep well? The girl descended a few more steps and nodded slightly. Edward was surprised. His daughter usually fled to her room when she saw strangers in the house. Are you hungry? Your housekeeper made a breakfast that smells delicious. Eleanor looked at her father as if asking for permission. Edward gestured towards the kitchen, trying not to show how emotional he was to see her wake up on her own and come down for breakfast. In the kitchen, Carmen, a stout woman in her 60s who had worked for the family for a decade, greeted Helen with polite curiosity. She was used to seeing professionals come and go, all with their methodologies and promises. Eleanor sat at the large wooden table where the family used to have their meals together. Now the 6 chairs seemed too large, highlighting the absence that hung over every moment. Helen sat next to the girl, not across from her, a subtle choice that made it feel less like an interrogation or therapy session. What a beautiful table, Helen commented. I bet you've had many delicious meals here. Eleanor toyed with her fork, pushing the scrambled eggs around, her plate without eating. Do you know what I like most about breakfast? Helen asked, helping herself to a slice of homemade bread that Carmen had prepared. It's that every day we can choose how to begin. Sometimes I wake up wanting something sweet, sometimes something savory. Today I woke up wanting something that reminded me of home. What's your home like? Eleanor asked suddenly, surprising both herself and the others. Edward almost dropped his coffee cup. His daughter hadn't asked a question in months. Helen smiled. It's very small. It has a kitchen that's almost entirely taken up. By the table, because I like having friends over to eat. And there's a garden in the back where I grow herbs. Basil, parsley, chives. Did your mother grow herbs too? Eleanor nodded, and Edward saw her eyes fill with tears. But they weren't the tears of despair he was used to seeing. They were tears of longing, which somehow seemed healthier. She taught me that Basil likes the morning sun, Eleanor said in a low voice, and that you can't water the leaves, only the soil. Your mother knew a lot about plants. I bet you learned a lot from her. The girl ate a forkful of eggs, the first real bite Edward had seen her take in weeks. At that moment, Clara came down the stairs hugging her teddy bear, still in her pajamas and looking sleepy. Seeing Eleanor at the table, she hesitated, but eventually approached and sat in a distant chair. Good morning, Clara, Helen said. How's your teddy bear today? Clara hugged the toy tighter but didn't run away as she usually did. Helen got up and went to the refrigerator, where there was a pitcher of orange juice. Can I get you some juice? Or would you prefer milk? Clara pointed to the juice, still without speaking. As Helen poured the drink, Carmen whispered to Edward, In 20 years of looking after children, I've never seen anyone get Clara to point at what she wanted. She always just shook her head. Edward watched the scene with a mix of hope and fear. What if Helen really could make a difference, and what if she couldn't? He couldn't bear another disappointment. Sophia was the last to appear, coming down the stairs very slowly, still sleepy and holding a small blanket. When she saw Helen, she didn't run to hide. She stood at the kitchen entrance, watching. "Hi, Sophia," Helen said without turning around, continuing to butter her bread. "If you want to sit with us, there's a chair here. But if you want to stay right there, that's okay too." Sophia hesitated for a few moments, then walked to the table and sat in the chair closest to the door, as if planning a quick escape if necessary. For the first time in months, the three sisters were sitting at the table at the same time. Edward felt a lump in his throat. Helen Maid, no comment about it, didn't try to force conversations or activities. She just ate her breakfast calmly, making a few casual remarks about the weather, about how delicious Carmen's bread was, about a bird she had seen at the window. "Do you know what my favorite bird is?" she asked. "Mockingbirds, because they're such chatterboxes. They spend all day singing all sorts of songs as if they're greeting everyone." Eleanor gave a small smile, almost imperceptible, but Edward caught the moment. After breakfast, Helen proposed something unusual. "How about we take a look at that garden outside, just to see how your mother's plants are doing?" Edward was about to protest. The girls hadn't been outside in months, but Eleanor stood up from her chair. "Can I go in my pajamas?" she asked. "Of course you can," Helen replied. "The plants don't care about clothes." Clara and Sophia followed them, still hesitant but curious. The garden was truly abandoned. The rose bushes were full of dead branches, the grass was high, the flower beds were overrun with weeds. But Helen showed no pity or sadness. She walked among the plants as if visiting old friends. "Look at this," she said, crouching beside her. "Rosebush. This one is trying to grow a new flower. See this little bud here?" The three girls drew closer, and Edward followed them at a respectful distance. "Why is it ugly?" asked Sophia, speaking for the first time in weeks. Edward felt as if the world had stopped. The voice of his youngest daughter, which he hadn't heard in so long, sounded like music. Helen showed no surprise, just answered naturally, "It's not ugly, Sophia. It just needs some care. Sometimes when we're sad for a long time, we also look like we need some care." Clara let go of her teddy bear and gently touched a leaf. "Mommy used to say that plants are happy when we talk to them," said Eleanor. "Your mother was right. Plants like attention, just like all living things." Helen stood up and looked around. "You know what I think? I think this garden is waiting for you to come back and take care of it." "But we don't know how," Eleanor protested. "Oh, but you do. Your mother taught you many things. It's all in here." Helen gently touched the girl's chest. "Sometimes we just need to remember." They stayed in the garden for a few more minutes, Helen pointing out plants that were trying to bloom, showing where there was life beneath the apparent destruction. Edward watched from a distance, impressed by the simplicity of her approach. There was no pressure, no demands, just the demonstration that there was still beauty in the world. When they went back inside, the girls seemed slightly less withdrawn. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but there was something different in the air. During the afternoon, Helen proposed simple activities, not forced games or obviously structured therapeutic activities, but natural things. Folding laundry while chatting, about nothing in particular, organizing the books on the shelf, helping Carmen prepare a snack. Eleanor offered to show Helen her drawings. They went to her room, and she opened a sketchbook full of somber figures, trees without leaves, houses without people, grey skies. Helen looked at each drawing with genuine attention. "You draw very well, Eleanor. These trees have a very beautiful shape." "They don't have leaves," the girl murmured. "That's true. But do you know what I think when I see a tree without leaves? I think it's resting, preparing for the next spring when it will be green again." Eleanor considered these words. "Do you think they'll have leaves again?" "I'm sure of it. Trees are very smart. They know that after winter always comes spring." At the end of the afternoon, as Helen was preparing to leave, Sophia approached her timidly. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" she asked quietly. Edward felt his heart race. His youngest daughter was showing she wanted someone's presence for the first time in months. "If you want me to come back, I'll come back," Helen replied. "I want you to," said Sophia. Me too, murmured Clara. Eleanor just nodded, but it was enough. When Helen left, Edward walked her to the gate. The sun was setting once more, but this time he didn't feel suffocated by the melancholy of the day's end. "How did you do that?" he asked. "In one day, my daughters have spoken more than they have in months." Helen adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "I just let them be children. Sad, hurt children, but still children. They didn't need to be healed to deserve attention. They deserved attention so they could heal." Edward reflected on these words as he watched her walk away. When he returned to the house, he found the three girls sitting on the living room sofa watching television together. They hadn't done that in over a year. Eleanor looked at him as he entered. "Dad, do you think Helen will really come back tomorrow?" "I think so," Edward replied, sitting beside them for the first time in months. "Did you like her?" "She doesn't feel sorry for us," Clara said suddenly, surprising everyone. It was the first full sentence she had spoken in weeks. "And she doesn't say that Mommy is in heaven and that we have to be happy," added Sophia. Edward realized his daughters had identified something he hadn't noticed. Helen hadn't tried to console them with platitudes or force them to feel better. She had simply acknowledged their pain as valid and stayed by their side anyway. That night, for the first time in a long time, the three girls slept without nightmares. Edward passed by their bedroom doors and saw Eleanor sleeping, hugging her sketchbook, Clara with her teddy bear nestled against her face, Sophia with the blanket only covering her legs, no longer hiding her whole body. They were small, almost imperceptible signs, but they carried the promise that maybe, just maybe, his family could find its way back to life. Edward lay down that night thinking of Marianne. For the first time since she had passed, he could remember her laugh without feeling only pain. He could imagine she would be happy to know that her daughters had smiled today, even if only for a few moments. And when he closed his eyes, he didn't dream of loss or regret. He dreamed of gardens blooming and the voices of children once again filling his home. A week had passed since Helen's arrival, and the house already breathed differently. It wasn't a complete transformation, but small miracles happened every day. Sophia had started speaking in full sentences again. Clara carried her teddy bear with less desperation, and Eleanor had drawn a tree with 3 small green buds. Edward observed these changes with a mixture of relief and fear. Fear that it was temporary, fear that his daughters might regress if Helen decided to leave. He had become dependent on the moments of normalcy she brought to their routine. On this Thursday morning, Helen arrived carrying 2 bags that seemed heavier than usual. Edward met her at the door, as had become their custom. "Good morning, Mr. Mason. Are the girls awake?" "Eleanor is. She's having breakfast. The other 2 are still getting ready." He hesitated for a moment. "Helen, can I ask you a question?" She stopped arranging the items from her bag and looked at him attentively. "Of course." "Are you sure you're doing the right thing? I mean, wouldn't it be better to maintain a more structured routine? Specific therapeutic activities?" Helen smiled in that gentle way Edward was learning to recognize. "Mr. Mason, your daughters aren't puzzles that need to be assembled with the right pieces in the right places. They are little girls who need to remember that the world can still be a safe place." Before he could respond, Eleanor appeared, running to greet Helen. It was the first time Edward had seen his eldest daughter move with any kind of urgency or enthusiasm. "Helen, did you bring what you promised?" Edward frowned. What promise? Helen opened one of the bags and took out small clay pots, packets of seeds, and a miniature watering can painted yellow. "I brought everything. Sunflower seeds, basil, parsley, and even some strawberry seeds." "Are we going to plant today?" Eleanor asked, her eyes shining in a way Edward hadn't seen in 2 years. "If you want to, and if your sisters want to as well." As if they had heard the conversation, Clara and Sophia appeared in the room. Clara was still hugging her teddy bear, but she wasn't clinging to it like a life raft anymore. Sophia walked normally, without the hunched posture of someone trying to disappear. "What are these little things?" Sophia asked, approaching the pots. "They're little pots for us to plant seeds," Eleanor explained proudly, as if she were an expert on the subject. Helen said we can make a small garden just for us. Clara gently touched one of the pots. And will they really grow? They will, Helen replied, but only if we take care of them with love. Water them every day. Put them in the sun. Talk to them. Talk to them? Sophia asked, amused. Of course. Plants like to hear kind voices. It makes them grow more beautiful. Edward watched the scene, trying to understand how Helen had managed to turn a gardening activity into something that seemed magical to his daughters. They set up on the back porch, where there was a wooden table Marianne used for crafts. Carmen brought old towels to cover the table and a bucket of water. Helen showed the girls how to put soil in the pots, making little holes with their fingers for the seeds. There was no rush, no pressure to do everything perfectly. It was just 3 little girls playing in the dirt with an adult who seemed as enchanted as they were. My mum used to say we have to make a wish when we plant a seed, Eleanor said suddenly. Edward felt his chest tighten. It was the first time she had mentioned Marianne spontaneously, without crying. What kind of wish? Helen asked. A good wish, for the little plant to grow strong and for us to be happy when we see it grow. Clara stopped playing with the soil and looked at her older sister. Can I make a wish too? You can. Each of us makes our own. Sophia planted her first sunflower seed with great care, as if it were a precious jewel. Then she closed her little eyes and whispered something no one could hear. What did you wish for, Sophia? Asked Eleanor. I can't tell or it won't come true, the little one replied seriously. Edward stepped away to get some water from the kitchen, but in truth he needed a moment to compose himself. Seeing his daughters making plans for the future, even if it was just to see a plant grow, moved him deeply. When he returned, Helen was telling the girls about different types of plants she had grown throughout her life. I've planted everything from lettuce to rose bushes. Each plant has its own personality. Some are more temperamental, others are very easy to care for. How did you learn? All that? Clara asked. Helen hesitated for a brief moment, and Edward noticed that shadow pass over her eyes again. I learned from my mother, and then I taught my daughter. The girls picked up on something in Helen's voice, a subtle change in tone. You have a daughter? Asked Eleanor. I did, Helen replied softly. Her name was Naomi. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but respectful. Edward saw his daughters processing the information with a maturity that always surprised him. Children who have experienced loss develop a special sensitivity to the pain of others. Did she like plants too? Asked Sophia. Helen smiled, but Edward could see tears forming in her eyes. She loved them, especially sunflowers. She said they were like little suns you could plant. Eleanor looked at the seed she had just planted. So when our sunflower grows, it will be like a little piece of her is here with us. The girl's words visibly touched Helen. She had to turn away to discreetly wipe her eyes. I think that's right, she agreed, her voice thick with emotion. Edward felt a wave of emotion wash over him. His daughters, who weeks ago were incapable of feeling anything but sadness, were now offering comfort to someone else. They were remembering how to show affection. The rest of the morning passed quickly. The girls planted 4 different types of seeds, watered the pots with excessive care, and chose the best spot on the porch for them to get sun. During lunch, for the first time in months, there was lively conversation at the table. The 3 of them talked about their plants, making plans for when they grew, discussing names for the sunflowers. What if we made a real garden out there, Clara suggested. Right, where Mommy planted the roses. Edward almost choked. His daughter was suggesting they touch Marianne's garden, something he had considered untouchable. Helen noticed his hesitation. What do you think, Mr. Mason? Would that be possible? All 3 girls looked at him expectantly. Edward found himself at an emotional crossroads. Part of him wanted to preserve the garden exactly as Marianne had left it, as a kind of memorial. But another part, a part that was growing every day with Helen's presence, wanted to see his daughters creating new memories. I think Mommy would be happy to see you. Taking care of her garden, he said finally. The smile Eleanor gave him was the first genuine full smile he had seen from her since Marianne's death. Clara clapped her hands, and Sophia bounced in her chair. Can we start tomorrow? Eleanor asked. We can, Helen agreed. But first, let's see how our little pots are doing. In the afternoon, Helen proposed something different. She said she wanted to get to know the family's story better, to understand what their life was like before the loss. Edward was reluctant, talking about the past hurt, but the girls were excited to talk about their mother. They sat in the living room, and Eleanor brought out photo albums. Helen flipped through the pages carefully, asking questions about each recorded moment. "Mommy was really funny," Sophia said. "She made different voices when she read stories to us. And she knew how to make the best chocolate cake in the world," added Clara. "Did she teach you the recipe?" Helen asked. The girls looked at each other. "We never tried to make it by ourselves," Eleanor admitted. Edward realized they had completely abandoned the traditions Marianne had established. The bedtime stories, the homemade birthday cakes, the afternoons of gardening. Everything had stopped when she was gone, as if those things couldn't exist without her. "Do you think you'd like to try making your mommy's cake one of these days?" Helen suggested. "But what if it doesn't turn out the same?" Sophia asked with concern. Helen leaned forward and held the little girl's hand. "Sophia, it doesn't have to be the same. It has to be made with love, and I'm sure you three know very well how to do things with love." Edward watched the conversation with fascination. Helen had identified something he hadn't noticed. His daughters had stopped doing the things that connected them to Marianne for fear of not doing them the right way. Helen was showing them that what mattered wasn't perfection, but intention. At the end of the afternoon, as Helen was preparing to leave, Eleanor approached her with a folded piece of paper. "This is for you," she said shyly. Helen opened the paper and found a drawing. 2 women and 3 little girls in a garden full of flowers. One of the women had long, dark hair, clearly representing Marianne. The other had brown hair tied in a bun. Helen. The 3 girls were smiling, and in the sky was a big yellow sun. "This is beautiful, Eleanor. May I ask who the people in the drawing are?" "You, us, and Mommy," the girl explained. "I thought she would like to meet you." Edward felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. His daughter's drawing showed a family where the deceased mother and the living caregiver coexisted harmoniously. It was a child's vision of trying to integrate her new reality with her memories. Helen knelt to Eleanor's level. "Thank you. I will keep this drawing forever. And you know, what else? I think I would have liked to meet your mother very much too." When Helen left, Edward walked her to the gate as usual, but this time he needed to ask a question that had been tormenting him. "Helen, may I ask what happened to your daughter?" She stopped and turned to face him. For a long moment she was silent, as if deciding how much she could share. "Naomi was 6 when she got sick. A blood disease that we couldn't beat. We fought for 2 years, tried everything, but..." Her voice faltered. Edward felt a deep connection to her pain. "I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. For a long time I thought I had failed her. That if I had done something different, been a better mother." Helen wiped away a tear that had escaped. "It took me years to understand that sometimes you can't save the ones you love, but you can honor their memory by helping others. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here." Edward watched Helen walk away down the tree-lined street of Beverly Hills. Now he understood her serenity, her infinite patience with his daughters. Helen wasn't just caring for 3 traumatized little girls. She was fulfilling a silent promise to her own daughter. When he returned home, he found the 3 girls on the porch, watering their little pots, even though Helen had said once a day was enough. "Dad, do you think Naomi can see our sunflowers from where she is?" Sophia asked. The question caught Edward off guard. "I think so," he replied after a moment. "I think she would be very happy seeing you take care of the plants." "And Mommy too," added Clara. Edward sat in the chair beside them, for the first time allowing himself to actively participate in the care routine Helen had established. "I think so too," he agreed. "I think they are both very proud of you." That night, Edward slept thinking how strange it was that a woman who had lost so much could teach his daughters to find hope again. And for the first time since Marianne's death, he could imagine a future where his family would be happy again. Not the same happiness as before. That was gone forever. But a new happiness built on the foundation of what they had lost and what they had learned to value. 3 weeks had passed since Helen entered the Mason family's life, and the transformation was visible in every corner of the house. The little pots on the porch already showed their first green sprouts, and the girls visited them religiously every morning, telling their little plants news as if they were pets. Edward was in the kitchen having coffee when he heard something that made him stop mid-motion. Laughter. Real, crystalline, free laughter coming from the backyard. He approached the window and saw a sight he hadn't witnessed in 2 years. Eleanor, Clara, and Sophia were on their knees in the dirt, hands dirty and huge smiles on their faces, helping Helen clear a flower bed. They weren't the withdrawn, silent children he had grown used to. They were normal girls, playing, talking over each other, arguing about where to plant each seedling. "Dad, come see," Sophia shouted when she noticed him at the window. Edward went outside and walked over to where they were. The garden had been completely transformed. The weeds had been removed, the grass was trimmed and new. Organized flower beds were taking shape. Helen had managed to preserve Marianne's original plants, while creating space for new additions. "Look what we found," said Clara, pointing to a rose bush that had been hidden under dead branches. Helen said it was just sleeping. Edward approached the rose bush. Marianne had planted that specific seedling in their first year of marriage. It was her favorite, a red rose that bloomed twice a year. It had disappeared under the wild vegetation, and Edward had assumed it was dead. "Will it bloom again?" he asked, gently touching the pruned branches. "It will," Helen replied with conviction. "Sometimes plants need to go through a difficult period before they can bloom again, but when they do, they often come back even more beautiful." Edward realized she wasn't just talking about the rose bush. "And look at this," exclaimed Eleanor, running to a corner of the garden where there was a small vegetable patch. "We planted cherry tomatoes, lettuce, and those herbs that Mommy liked. Basil, parsley, and chives," Clara completed with pride. Sophia pulled on Edward's hand. "Come see our special project." She led him to a circular bed in the center of the garden, where a small tree Edward didn't recognize had been planted. "It's a fig tree," Helen explained. "The girls chose it because they said their mother loved figs." Edward felt his eyes well up. Marianne had indeed loved figs. She had always talked about planting a tree in the garden, but had never gotten around to it. "How long will it take to bear fruit?" Eleanor asked. "A few years," Helen replied. "But when it starts, it will give figs every year. It will be like a gift that keeps on giving." Edward saw the wisdom behind the choice. Helen was teaching his daughters to think about the future, to make long-term plans, to believe there would be a few years from now where they would be there to harvest the fruit. Carmen appeared at the kitchen door. "Mr. Mason, there's a call for you. It's Dr. Oakley." Edward hesitated. He hadn't taken the girls for a checkup in 3 weeks. He had cancelled the last appointments because they seemed so well that he didn't want to risk interrupting their progress. "Can you tell him I'll call him back?" he asked. "He said it's important, about the girls' tests." Edward felt a pang of anxiety. What tests? He hadn't authorized any recent tests. Helen noticed his concern. "Go take the call, we'll stay out here." Edward went inside with his heart pounding. Dr. Oakley never called unless it was something serious. "Dr. Oakley, Edward Mason." "Edward, good to hear from you. Look, I'm calling because I'm concerned. You've missed the last 3 scheduled appointments. How are the girls?" Edward breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't a medical emergency. "Doctor, to be honest, they're much better. I hired a new caregiver and—" "Edward," the doctor's voice turned serious, "I know you're trying to help your daughters, but we can't stop the medical follow-up. Their condition was very serious. We need to monitor for any relapse. But doctor, they're eating normally, sleeping without nightmares, talking, playing." "Edward, you're not a doctor. There may be signs you're not noticing. I need to examine the girls this week. I'll reschedule for Friday." Edward looked out the window and saw his daughters planting flowers, chatting excitedly, looking like normal, healthy children. "All right, doctor. Friday it is." When he hung up the phone, he felt as if a dark cloud had passed over the sunny day. What if Dr. Oakley found something wrong? What if he decided Helen wasn't qualified to care for the girls? What if he recommended hospitalization or medications that would make them regress? Edward returned to the garden, trying to hide his worry, but Helen immediately saw that something was wrong. "Everything okay?" she asked discreetly, while the girls were distracted choosing where to plant some sunflower seedlings. "The girls' doctor wants to see them on Friday. I'm worried about what he'll think of all this." Helen nodded with understanding. "You're afraid he won't approve of the methods we're using?" "I'm afraid he'll want to change something. The girls are doing so well now." "Edward." Helen used his first name for the first time, which surprised him. "Regardless of what the doctor says, the progress your daughters have made is real. No one can take that away from them." "But what if he wants to admit them, or prescribe heavy medications?" "Then you'll have a difficult decision to make, but remember, you are their father. The final decision is yours." Edward watched Eleanor explain to Clara how to plant sunflower seeds at the right depth. Sophia was humming a song she had learned from Helen while watering the new beds. These were scenes of normalcy he had thought he would never see again. "Helen, can I ask you something personal?" She stopped working the soil and looked at him. "Of course." "Did you take your daughter to many doctors during her illness?" Helen closed her eyes for a moment, as if preparing to dive into painful memories. "I took her to every possible doctor. We did every treatment they recommended, followed every protocol." Her voice grew quieter. "And still, it wasn't enough." "Do you regret anything?" Helen was silent for a long moment, watching the girls play. "I regret spending so much time in hospitals, that I forgot to live the good moments we still had. I regret focusing so much on the illness that I stopped seeing the child." She looked directly at Edward. "Your daughters are not sick, Edward. They are hurt, and hurts heal with love, time, and patience." Her words touched Edward deeply. In the months after Marianne's death, he had treated his daughters as if they were terminal patients, not grieving children who needed affection. In the afternoon, Helen suggested something that surprised everyone: a picnic in the garden. Carmen prepared sandwiches, fresh juice, and some fruit. They spread a checkered blanket under the fig tree and all sat down together. It was a scene reminiscent of the picnics Edward and Marianne used to have with the girls in the early years of their marriage. But this time, instead of bringing sadness, the memory brought a sense of continuity, as if they were honoring the past while building something new. "Helen," Eleanor said suddenly, "can you live here forever?" The question took everyone by surprise. Edward felt his heart race. He hadn't thought about what would happen when Helen decided her work there was done. Helen smiled, but Edward noticed a hesitation in her eyes. "I'll stay as long as you need me," she answered carefully. "But how will we know when we don't need you anymore?" asked Clara. "I think you'll know. When you feel strong enough to take care of the garden by yourselves, to take care of each other, to take care of your father." Sophia laughed. "We already take care of Dad. Yesterday I reminded him to brush his teeth." Edward smiled. It was true. In recent days, his daughters had started showing concern for him again, including him in their activities, treating him like a father and not a distant, grieving figure. "And what will you do when you leave here?" Eleanor asked. Helen grew thoughtful. "I'll look for other families that need help, other children who have forgotten how to smile." Edward felt a pang of jealousy, imagining Helen caring for other children with the same dedication she showed his daughters. "But can you visit us?" asked Sophia. "Of course I can. And you can send me pictures of the plants so I can see how they're growing." As the sun began to set, they cleared away the picnic things. The girls ran inside to take their baths, leaving Edward and Helen alone in the garden. "Helen, I need to tell you something." She stopped folding the blanket and looked at him attentively. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for us. In 3 weeks, you've given me my family back. Your family was always here, Edward. You just needed to remember how to connect again." Edward hesitated, then decided to be completely honest. "I'm afraid of when you leave, that they'll regress, that I won't be able to maintain this." He gestured to the blooming garden, to the house that had come back to life. Helen stepped closer to him. Edward, look at your daughters today. Really look at them. They are not the same girls I met 3 weeks ago. They have grown. They have become stronger. And so have you. I don't feel strong. You were in the garden with them today, participating, laughing, making plans. When was the last time that happened before I arrived? Edward realized she was right. He had spent months watching his daughters from a distance, as if they were fragile creatures that might break if he got too close. Helen had taught him that they needed him present, not protected. And what if the doctor wants to change everything? Then you will stand up for what's best for your daughters. You are their father, Edward. You know them better than any doctor. That night, Edward put the girls to bed for the first time in 2 years. It was a routine Marianne had always done, and that he had abandoned after her death, leaving it to nannies and nurses. But today, all 3 specifically asked him to tell them a story. Edward sat on Eleanor's bed with Clara and Sophia snuggled up next to their older sister. What story do you want to hear? Tell us about the princess who planted magic flowers, requested Sophia. Edward frowned. I don't know that story. Helen told it to us, Clara explained, but we want to hear you tell it. Edward improvised a story about a princess who had lost her kingdom to an evil witch, but discovered she could win it back by planting flowers that brought joy back to the people. It was a simple story, but laden with symbolism that his daughters intuitively understood. When he finished, Eleanor hugged him tightly. Dad, Helen is like the princess in the story. She brought the magic flowers to us. Edward kissed his daughter's forehead. And you are the princesses who learned to plant your own magic flowers. When he left their room, Edward felt more like a father than he had in a very long time. Helen was in the living room packing her bag to leave. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For teaching me how to be a father to my daughters again. Helen smiled. You were always their father, Edward. You were just lost in your own pain. When she left, Edward stood on the porch watching the garden under the moonlight. Tomorrow would be another day of discoveries, another day of growth. And on Friday, he would have to face Dr. Oakley and defend the new life they had built together. But for the first time in a long time, Edward felt ready to fight for his family's happiness. Friday arrived laden with tension. Edward had slept poorly, imagining all the possible scenarios for the appointment with Dr. Oakley. Helen noticed his nervousness and suggested the girls wear their favorite clothes as if it were a special event, not a doctor's visit. Eleanor chose a blue dress that Marianne had bought for her last birthday. Clara wore a flared yellow skirt that made her twirl like a ballerina. Sophia opted for a pink outfit with butterfly designs. They were all radiant, chatting excitedly about their plants on the way to the office. Edward watched his 3 daughters in the rear-view mirror, seeing how different they were from the withdrawn children he had taken to the doctor months before. Would Dr. Oakley be able to see the transformation, or would he focus only on medical protocols? Dr. Oakley's office was in Westwood, in a modern building with a view of the city. When they arrived, the receptionist greeted them with surprise. My, what beautiful girls! You look so different from the last time you were here. Edward felt a momentary sense of relief. If even the receptionist had noticed the difference, maybe the doctor would too. In the waiting room, the girls behaved like normal children. Eleanor flipped through a magazine, Clara organized the scattered toys, and Sophia whispered to a doll she had brought. There were no signs of the paralyzing anxiety they used to show in medical settings. The Mason family, the nurse called. Dr. Oakley was a serious man in his 50s, a specialist in child psychiatry. Edward had always respected him professionally, but today he felt as if he were defending his daughters from a judgment. Edward, good to see you, and girls, look how you've grown. To Edward's surprise, Eleanor replied, Good morning, Dr. Oakley. How are you? The doctor seemed genuinely surprised. Eleanor hadn't spoken to him since the first appointment months ago. I'm very well, thank you, and how are you feeling? Good, we planted a garden at home. Do you want to see the pictures? Eleanor took Edward's phone and showed him the photos they had taken of the plants. Clara and Sophia came closer, excited to talk about their sunflowers and the fig tree. Dr. Oakley looked at the images with growing attention. You did all this yourselves? Helen helped, Clara explained. She taught us how to take care of the plants and talk to them. Helen? Edward stepped forward. She's the new caregiver I hired. A different approach, more human. The doctor nodded, but Edward noticed a concern in his eyes. I see. Well, let's proceed with our usual evaluation. For the next hour, Dr. Oakley conducted a series of one-on-one conversations with each girl. Edward stayed in the waiting room, anxious, trying to guess from the tone of the voices he heard through the door how the evaluation was going. When he was finally called back in, the doctor was visibly impressed. Edward, please sit down. I need to talk to you. Edward braced himself for the worst. In 20 years of my career, I have rarely seen such a significant transformation in children with the condition your daughters presented. The doctor paused to gather his thoughts. Eleanor is communicative, shows interest in the future, and talks about her mother without panicking. Clara has regained natural facial expressions and interacts socially. Sophia told me a 10-minute story about a butterfly she saw in the garden. Edward felt as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. So they're okay? More than okay. They are developing healthily. They still carry the pain of their loss, of course, but they have learned to live with it constructively. Dr. Oakley leaned forward. Edward, what exactly did this Helen do? Edward thought about the question. How could he explain in a few words the quiet magic Helen had brought into their lives? She treated them like children, not patients. She taught them to live with their grief instead of being destroyed by it. Does she have a background in psychology? Family therapy? Not that I know of. She just understands children who have gone through loss. Dr. Oakley was silent for a moment. Edward, regardless of the unorthodox methods, the results are undeniable. Your daughters are emotionally healed. I still recommend a checkup every 6 months, but I see no need for medication or intensive therapy. Edward felt tears of relief welling in his eyes. Doctor, can I ask you something? What would have happened if they had continued on the path they were on before? The doctor hesitated. We likely would have had to consider hospitalization for intensive treatment. Their condition was deteriorating rapidly. Edward left the office with a sense of absolute victory. Helen had literally saved his daughters from a fate he didn't even want to imagine. On the way back home, they stopped at an ice cream shop in Santa Monica. The girls chose different flavors and sat on a bench to eat, talking about everything and nothing as normal children do. Dad, Eleanor said suddenly, the doctor asked if we wished Mommy could come back. Edward felt his chest tighten. And what did you say? I said I really wished she could, Eleanor continued, but that if she can't come back, then we have to be as happy as we can be now. The words of his 7-year-old daughter carried a wisdom that moved Edward deeply. Clara licked her ice cream thoughtfully. And I said that Mommy wouldn't like it if we were sad forever. Sophia, always the most direct, added, I said that Mommy sent Helen to take care of us while she can't. Edward looked at his 3 daughters and realized they had found their own way to understand and accept their new reality. Helen had given them the tools to build a narrative where loss and hope could coexist. When they got home, Helen was waiting for them in the garden with a surprise. She had prepared a small outdoor party to celebrate her first month with the family. Colorful banners were strung between the trees. The table was set with a homemade cake and fresh flowers from the garden, decorated every corner. It's a party, shouted Sophia, running to hug Helen. How was the doctor's? Helen asked Edward quietly as the girls explored the decorations. Perfect. He said they're healed. Helen smiled, but Edward noticed something different in her eyes. A kind of satisfaction mixed with sadness. The party was magical. The girls showed Helen all the plants that had grown, told her about the doctor's appointment, and made plans for new additions to the garden. Carmen joined them for the cake, which was delicious, the recipe Marianne used to make, which Helen had taught the girls to prepare. As the sun began to set, Helen gathered the girls around the table. Girls, I have something important to talk to you about. Edward felt his stomach clench. From the way she spoke, he knew what was coming. Do you remember when you asked how you would know when you didn't need me anymore? The 3 nodded silently. Well, I think that time has come. No, Sophia protested immediately. You can't leave. Helen knelt to the little girl's level and held her hands. "Sophia, look around you. Look at the garden you've created, at how you take care of each other, at how your daddy has started to smile again. You don't need me anymore." "But we want you here," said Clara, with tears in her eyes. "And I will always be here." Helen touched Clara's chest. "In your heart. Everything we did together, all the things you learned, no one can take that away." Eleanor, always the most mature, asked, "Are you going to take care of other children like you took care of us?" "I am. There are many families who need to learn what you've learned." Edward approached. "Helen, are you sure? The girls love you. We would like you to stay." Helen looked at him fondly. "Edward, when I came here, you were a broken family. Now you are a healed family. My work here is done." "When are you leaving?" asked Eleanor, trying to be brave. "Tomorrow morning. But before that, we have the whole evening to say a proper goodbye." They spent the evening doing special things together. Helen taught the girls to make flower-shaped cookies. They told stories under the fig tree, and they made one last round through the garden, checking on each plant. At bedtime, Helen went with Edward to put the girls to bed for the last time. "Helen," Eleanor said as she was about to leave the room, "can you take a picture of us, so you don't forget us?" Helen picked up the photo from the bedside table, a recent portrait of the three girls smiling in the garden, and put it in her bag. "Thank you, I'll keep it forever." When the girls finally fell asleep, Edward and Helen sat on the porch with 2 cups of tea. "How do you know when it's time to leave?" Edward asked. "When I see that a family no longer needs a savior, but just time to grow on their own." Helen looked at the blooming garden. "Your daughters will keep growing, Edward, and you will continue to be a wonderful father. You don't need me anymore." "What if a problem comes up? What if they regress?" "They won't regress. Do you know why? Because they aren't just following a recipe I brought. They've created their own tools to deal with life." Edward was silent, absorbing her words. "Helen, can I ask you something I've always wanted to know?" "Of course." "What do you do when you're not saving families like ours?" Helen smiled sadly. "I remember my daughter. I plant flowers on the balcony of my small apartment. Sometimes I visit the cemetery where she is, and I look for other families who need help." "Have you managed to make peace with her loss?" Helen was thoughtful for a long moment. "You know, Edward, when I lost Naomi, I thought my life was over too. I spent 2 years just existing. Then I started working with other families, and I realized that every child I helped was a way of honoring her memory. That's why you do this. That's why I do this. Naomi can't grow up anymore, can't plant flowers anymore, can't smile anymore. But every time I see a child start to smile again, it's as if a little piece of her is still alive in the world." Edward understood that Helen had found her own way to transform pain into something beautiful. The next morning, Helen prepared to leave. Her few belongings were already in the cloth bag, the same one she had arrived with a month earlier. The girls were waiting for her in the garden, each holding a small pot with a seedling they had prepared, as a gift. "This is for you to plant at your house," Eleanor explained, "so you'll remember us every day." Helen received the pots with tears in her eyes. "Girls, you are the most special gifts I have ever received." They hugged in a group, and Edward realized it wasn't a sad farewell, but a grateful one. "Helen," said Clara, "when our sunflowers get really big, we'll send you a picture. And when the fig tree has fruit, you have to come back and eat with us," added Sophia. Helen nodded yes, though they all knew she would likely be caring for other families by the time that happened. Edward walked her to the gate. When they got there, she turned to him. "Edward, thank you for trusting me. I'm the one who should thank you. You gave me my family back." Helen took one last look at the house, where the girls were waving from the window, and then at Edward. "They're going to be fine, and so are you." Edward watched her walk away down the tree-lined street of Beverly Hills, carrying her seedlings and her cloth bag, ready to find another family that needed to rediscover hope. When he returned to the house, he found the girls in the kitchen, making breakfast by themselves for the first time. "Dad, we thought we'd make pancakes to start the day off right," said Eleanor, naturally assuming her role as the older sister. Edward sat at the table and watched his daughters working together, caring for one another, including him in their conversations. Helen was right. They no longer needed saving. They just needed to keep growing together. 6 months later, Edward received a simple letter with no return address. Inside was a photo. 3 enormous sunflowers planted in a small apartment with a message on the back. "The girls' seedlings are beautiful. I hope they are too. With love, Helen." That same day, Eleanor, now 8, was in the garden picking basil to help Carmen with dinner. Clara, at 6, hummed as she watered the plants. Sophia, now 5, had drawn a happy family to hang on the refrigerator. The fig tree had grown and promised its first fruit next year. Edward watched all of this from the kitchen window, remembering the desperate man who had interviewed Helen months before. That man had lost a wife and had almost lost his daughters to grief. This man had learned that love doesn't die with loss, it just transforms. Marianne remained present in the family's memory, but now as a source of strength, not sadness. Her plants bloomed in the garden cared for by her daughters. Her cake recipe was made every Sunday, and her stories were told at bedtime. Helen had fulfilled her silent promise. She had planted hope where there had only been pain. She had taught a family how to live again. And somewhere in Los Angeles, she was likely doing the same for another family that needed to rediscover that life, even after the greatest losses, could still be beautiful. Dear listeners, we hope the Mason family's journey has deeply touched your hearts. This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments of life, when pain seems to consume us completely, there is still hope. Helen taught us that healing doesn't come from magic formulas or quick fixes, but from genuine presence, unconditional love, and the patience to allow each person to find their own way back to life. If this narrative stirred emotions in you, if you recognized pieces of your own journey in the words we shared, please leave a like to show us that stories like this make a difference. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories that bring light to the deepest corners of the human experience. And in the comments, tell us, what moment touched your heart the most? What lesson will you take from this story of overcoming and rebirth? Every day, we bring you intense and transformative accounts that celebrate the incredible strength that exists within each of us. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, where another family will discover that true love can heal any wound.